Have you heard this story of a man who returned to a town that no longer remembered him, even though every stone seemed to know his name? I arrived at Greyhaven just before dusk, the sky bruised purple and copper, clouds hanging low like a warning whispered too late. The train hissed behind me as it pulled away, metal screaming against metal, leaving a sudden, aching silence broken only by the wind threading through broken reeds along the platform. The air smelled of wet iron and pine sap, sharp enough to sting my lungs. I stood there with my coat collar turned up, listening to my own breath, wondering why my hands were trembling when I had come here by choice. The town crouched between dark hills and a river that moved too slowly, as if thinking about each inch before surrendering to it. Street lamps flickered alive one by one, their light jaundiced and weak, casting long, crooked shadows that seemed to bend toward me. I felt watched. Not by people, there were none in sight, but by the buildings themselves, their windows black and reflective, holding secrets like held breath. My thoughts kept circling the same question. Why had the letter found me after all these years? No return address. Just my name, written in ink so dark it looked like it had soaked into the paper from another world. I walked toward the old quarter, boots echoing against cracked pavement. Each step felt louder than it should have been, as if the town were amplifying my presence, resenting it. The wind picked up, carrying with it a low sound, almost like chanting beneath the rustle of leaves. I told myself it was only the river, or maybe power lines humming in the cold, but fear crept along my spine anyway. I remembered being a child here, remembered laughter, remembered warmth. None of that greeted me now. The inn at the crossroads was still standing, its wooden sign creaking, paint peeling to reveal older layers beneath, names crossed out and replaced again and again. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and old smoke. A fire burned low in the hearth, crackling like it was chewing bones. The innkeeper, a woman with eyes too pale, looked up at me with a start, as if she had been expecting someone else, or dreading me. Her silence stretched until it hurt. "You shouldn't have come back," she said finally, voice thin and trembling. The words lodged in my chest. I wanted to ask why, but something in her gaze warned me that answers here were not given freely, and that every truth carried a price. Upstairs, as the floorboards groaned beneath my weight, I felt the first unmistakable brush of something unseen, a pressure in the air, a whisper against my ear that sounded disturbingly like my own voice calling my name from far away. Sleep did not come easily. The room smelled of damp wood and old linens, and the wind rattled the window like an impatient hand. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were thick and feverish, full of running footsteps and doors that led nowhere. I woke to a sound that dragged me back to consciousness with a jolt. Scratching, slow and deliberate, coming from inside the walls. My heart hammered as I lay still, counting breaths, listening. The scratching paused, then resumed closer, as if whatever made it had learned where I was. Moonlight spilled across the floor, pale and cold. I sat up, every nerve screaming at me to flee, but another part of me, stubborn, reckless, insisted on answers. The letter burned in my pocket. I followed the sound into the hallway, each step accompanied by the soft moan of old wood. The inn was silent, yet the air felt crowded, thick with an invisible presence. I could almost hear murmurs, fragments of conversations that ended decades ago. Outside, the town had changed. Fog rolled in, dense and swallowing, muting sound and bending distance. The street seemed longer than before, houses leaning inward like conspirators. I walked toward the river, guided by an instinct I did not trust. As I approached, the chanting returned, clearer now, layered voices rising and falling in a rhythm that made my skin prickle. The water reflected no stars, only darkness, rippling as if disturbed by something beneath. Shapes moved along the far bank, figures too tall, limbs bending wrong, their silhouettes smearing and reforming. Fear tightened my throat, Yet I found myself stepping closer, compelled by a pull I could not name. Memories surfaced unbidden. A childhood game, a dare, a night we should never have gone to the river. I tasted copper as realization dawned. Whatever haunted Greyhaven knew me because I had helped create it. One of the figures turned, and for a heartbeat I saw a face I recognized, twisted and hollow-eyed. My knees nearly buckled. Guilt crashed over me in waves, hot and suffocating. I whispered an apology to the fog, to the river, to the dead air itself. The chanting stopped. In the sudden silence, a voice spoke clearly, right behind me, promising that what was owed would be collected before dawn. I ran. The town blurred as panic drove me through alleys and across empty squares, breath tearing from my lungs. Sounds chased me, wet footsteps, a low, eager laughter that scraped along my nerves. The sky darkened further, clouds swallowing the moon, plunging everything into a murky half-light. I ducked into an abandoned chapel, its doors hanging open, hinges shrieking as I shoved them wider. Inside, the smell of mold and old incense clung to the air, thick and oppressive. Candles lined the altar, unlit yet warm, wax soft as if recently touched. My thoughts raced, colliding, trying to make sense of impossible things. I remembered the night again, clearer now. The ritual we found in a book that should have stayed buried, the promise of power, the laughter that turned to screams. We were children, arrogant and bored, and we tore something open that never closed. The thing that came through wore familiar faces, because that was how it learned us. The chapel shuddered as something struck the walls from outside, once, twice, testing. Dust rained from the ceiling. I pressed my back to the altar, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. Fear argued with resolve inside my head. I could run until my body failed, or I could face what I had abandoned. My hands shook as I found the chalk still hidden beneath the altar, and probably intact. Symbols flooded back to me, burned into memory by regret. I began to draw, each line a confession, each curve a plea. The air grew colder, my breath fogging. Whispered voices crowded close, mocking and pleading in equal measure. When the door finally burst inward, the creature that entered wore my childhood friend's smile, split too wide, eyes reflecting nothing. I stood my ground, terror screaming, and spoke the words I had sworn never to say again. The ground trembled. The candles flared to life, shadows writhing like living things. Pain exploded through my head as the ritual took hold, memories ripping free, offering themselves up as fuel. I screamed until my throat tore, but I did not stop. The creature recoiled, its form destabilizing, faces slipping and reforming in a grotesque parade of the past. Outside, the town seemed to answer, buildings groaning, the river roaring as if in fury. I felt small, breakable, yet fiercely determined. This was my debt. The voices rose to a crescendo, then faltered. The symbols on the floor burned white-hot, searing my vision. I thought of all the years I had tried to forget, of the cowardice that had carried me away while others stayed and suffered. Tears streamed down my face, blurring the world. With a final, desperate shout, I completed the circle, slamming my palm down, blood spilling to seal it. Silence crashed in, sudden and absolute. The creature collapsed inward, folding like ash caught in a vacuum, then was gone. The chapel stood empty, candles guttering. I slumped to the floor, shaking, every muscle aching. Outside, dawn began to creep in, a thin, fragile light. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by an aching sorrow that settled deep in my bones. I stumbled out into the street as the sun rose fully, revealing a town that looked lighter. Windows reflected the sky again. The air smelled clean, washed. People emerged cautiously from doorways, confusion and relief etched on their faces. None recognized me. Perhaps that was fitting. As I walked toward the station, The hills no longer seemed to lean inward. Greyhaven exhaled, and I with it, knowing some wounds never vanish, they only stop bleeding. The train arrived slowly, almost reluctantly, as if even the iron and steam understood that leaving this place should never be easy. Its distant whistle cut through the morning like a blade through fog, long and mournful, echoing across the newly quiet town. I stood on the platform alone, my coat hanging heavier on my shoulders than it had the night before, soaked not with rain, but with everything I had carried back out of Greyhaven. The sky above was pale and washed clean, streaked with soft gold and exhausted blue, the kind of dawn that follows catastrophe and pretends nothing has happened. Cold air slid into my lungs, sharp and bracing, and for the first time since my arrival, it did not feel hostile. My hand throbbed where blood had sealed the circle. The pain was deep, rhythmic, synchronized with my heartbeat, as though the town itself still had a pulse inside me. I flexed my fingers slowly, watching the skin pull tight, feeling the scar already beginning to form. It would never fade completely. I knew that with a certainty that settled calmly in my chest. Some marks are not meant to disappear. They exist to remind us that survival is not the same as innocence. Behind me, Greyhaven stirred. Doors opened cautiously. Footsteps echoed, tentative at first, then more confident. Murmured voices rose and fell, confused but undeniably human. I did not turn around. I was afraid that if I saw their faces clearly, relief and grief side by side, something inside me would break open again. I had done what I came to do, even if I hadn't known it when I arrived. Whatever remained was theirs now, not mine. The train hissed as it slowed, steam rolling over the platform like a final exhale. Metal groaned, wheels shrieked, and the familiar industrial sounds felt strangely comforting after a night filled with whispers and impossible voices. As the doors opened, warm air spilled out, carrying the scent of oil, fabric, and distant places. I stepped forward, then paused, a sudden wave of emotion crashing into me so hard, I had to grip the railing to stay upright. My thoughts tangled painfully. I thought of the children we had been, reckless and curious, believing consequences were things that happened to other people. I thought of the night by the river, the laughter that had cracked into fear, the moment when something unseen had noticed us noticing it. I thought of the years I spent running, changing cities, changing names, convincing myself that distance could erase responsibility. The truth, sharp and undeniable, settled in my mind. I had not returned to Greyhaven to save it. I had returned because it would not let me go. As I boarded the train, the interior lights hummed softly overhead. The carriage was nearly empty, rows of worn seats stretching forward like a corridor into the future. I chose a window seat and sank into it, my body finally allowing itself to acknowledge exhaustion. Every muscle trembled faintly, the aftershock of fear and exertion rippling beneath my skin. My eyes burned, heavy and dry, yet I did not sleep. I wasn't ready to let go of consciousness just yet. The train lurched into motion, slow at first, then steadier, the rhythmic clatter of wheels forming a hypnotic pattern. Through the window, Greyhaven began to slide backward, buildings shrinking, streets unraveling into lines and angles. In the daylight, the town looked almost ordinary. Brick and wood, glass and stone. No sign of the things that had pressed against reality only hours earlier. I wondered, briefly, if anyone would ever truly believe what had happened here. Then I realized it didn't matter. Some truths are not meant to be shared. They are meant to be born. As the distance grew, I felt something subtle loosen inside me. Not relief exactly, more like a long-held breath finally released. The constant pressure behind my eyes eased. The oppressive weight that had followed me for years, invisible but relentless, thinned to a dull ache. I rested my forehead against the cool glass, watching the hills roll by, green and indifferent, ancient and unmoved by human mistakes. Images flickered through my mind unbidden. The chapel filled with light, the collapsing form of the creature, the silence that followed. I replayed my own voice speaking words I had once feared, felt again the terror of standing still when every instinct screamed to flee. A quiet pride emerged beneath the sorrow, fragile but real. I had stayed. When it mattered, when running would have been easier, I had stayed. Yet guilt remained. It always would. Not as a punishment, but as a responsibility. I understood that now. Guilt was not something to be erased. It was something to be carried properly, acknowledged rather than denied. It was the weight that kept memory honest. The landscape outside shifted gradually, forests thinning, fields opening, the river reappearing in flashes of silver between trees. Sunlight spilled across the carriage, warming my face, illuminating dust motes drifting lazily in the air. Ordinary beauty, simple and profound, filled me with a quiet awe. The world had continued while I was trapped in the gravity of my past. It would continue now, regardless of what I chose to do next. I wondered who I would be after this. Not the man who fled, not the boy who summoned horrors without understanding them. Someone new, perhaps unfinished, but finally facing forward. The thought was frightening in its own way. Change always is. But beneath the fear, there was a steady, growing resolve. I would live carefully. I would remember. I would not pretend that darkness was rare or distant, but I would also not let it define the limits of my life. As hours passed, the pain in my hand dulled to a manageable throb. Fatigue wrapped around me like a blanket, heavy but not suffocating. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered, lines etched by worry and regret, eyes shadowed but clear. I held the gaze for a long moment, silently promising myself that I would not waste the second chance I had taken by force. Eventually, my eyelids grew too heavy to resist. As I drifted towards sleep, the sound of the train softened, blending with my breathing, with the quiet certainty that something had truly ended. Greyhaven would remain behind me, sealed not just by ritual, but by acceptance. It would live on in whispers, in scars, in stories half remembered and half denied. And I would carry it forward, not as a curse, but as a lesson written deep into who I had become. The train raced onward, carrying me toward a future still undefined, and for the first time in years, that uncertainty felt like freedom rather than fear. Leave a like and subscribe, so it will be easier for us to continue releasing this kind of content.